After that, we'll go into a quick summary and then right into Q&A. And like I said, this whole presentation is only about 20 minutes, so plenty of time for questions, or also we're happy to follow up with additional information after the call. And with that, let's get started. So I'm looking at my screen and I can see the attendee list with a lot of familiar names on it. So I probably don't have to tell you guys or anyone in this industry that the pandemic has changed how people shop for groceries pretty drastically. A couple of recent quotes that we pulled as we were getting ready for this call. Washington Post said, "The pandemic has altered what products people purchase and when and where and who is buying them and how much time is devoted to the endeavor." New York Times said, "For the first time in a generation, Americans began spending more money at the supermarket than at places where someone else made the food." And we are seeing that on our list to a T. So one survey that we read said 70% of people are spending more time on mobile than they did pre-pandemic. We feel that the most when we're looking at the usage of our grocery list apps. So we have over 25 apps on our platform, and across them, we can see that our audience is spending more time making their lists as well as adding more products to those lists than we ever saw before. Another big story, we know that e-com is spiking in popularity. So although most shopping is still done in store, the adoption of e-com is going to have long-standing effects and completely change at least how some products are bought. And we'll show you some insights into that. And then finally, the specific categories and products that people are planning to buy and buying in store have changed. More on that in a second. That was kind of the biggest surprise for us and our team, not just volume levels, but what people are buying. And we'll go into that in more detail. Before we look at the actual data, and I promise that's the next slide, it's coming, just a couple of things to remember, because we want to make sure that the data we're showing you makes sense or has some context around it. So AdAdapted is seeing millions of shoppers using our list apps, and those shoppers are generating billions of anonymized records. These records or list activity are showing us what these consumers are adding to their lists and crossing off. So effectively, they're showing us what they intend to buy in store. It's first-party data for AdAdapted, and we can pull it in real time. So let's take a look. Okay. So we started with this one because it includes a pretty widely covered story that most of us are familiar with. And we wanted to show you how a real life story, how that was taking shape on the list that we were seeing. So when the pandemic hit, most of us know consumers started hoarding toilet paper. In fact, in a study earlier this year, Nielsen said that toilet paper sales in the early pandemic jumped by 22%. And this is what we saw. So it's important to note that in this index, we're looking at transactions per 1,000 shoppers in our network. So we're normalizing the data a little bit. So for every 1,000 shoppers we see, this is a relative index showing us how many people have toilet paper on their shopping lists. In the green line, we see 2019. So this is a line that makes sense to us, right? This is a flat line throughout the year. When we look back at 2017 or 2018, it's the same story. The blue line shows what happened in 2020. So you can see at the beginning of the year, it stayed relatively flat. Demand doesn't fluctuate a lot. But then in late February, early March, when the pandemic news started to be announced, all of a sudden you see this huge spike. The spike went straight up and then stayed elevated for about 6 weeks. And then instead of leveling off, what we saw is it actually dropped far below what we saw in 2019 in terms of levels. Stayed that way, continues to stay that way. It looks like it's a flat line, but it's going to stay consistent and keep being decreased from what we saw prior. Let's look at paper towels. It's a similar story, albeit not quite as dramatic. So same thing, early in the year, stayed pretty flat like we've seen in previous years, but then all of a sudden we saw the same spike. Like toilet paper, after a few weeks, that started to drop off and actually dropped below what we saw in 2019 numbers. This one's slightly different because it looks like the gap is shrinking. However, we're still seeing that these levels are decreased over what we saw the year prior. So for our first category, what does this mean? What's happening? So I think we're not going to go too far into this. The spikes make sense. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was hoarding behavior. People were afraid that they wouldn't have access to these products. But after that, a couple of different things were going on. One, well-stocked families no longer needed paper products. Some had garages full of them. Two, shoppers couldn't find these products at store, so they started to remove them from their shopping list. And because of that, we also saw rises in e-com. So when consumers couldn't buy paper products in store, they switched to buying online, and many never switched back. In this case, I do want to point out, we're not talking about people switching from shopping in store to e-com completely. Again, this is a list that represents 1,000 shoppers, all of whom are still shopping in store and actually adding more products to their list. They're just not adding these products. So for the holidays, we expect these trends to continue. Our best advice for marketers is really work on segmenting who is going to be buying paper products in store versus who will start switching to buying those products online, and be ready to message them both appropriately. So segment them and also have creative that's personalized to that unique shopper. All right, next one. This is also kind of a fun one because a fair amount has been written about baking. I mean, people have more time, it's comforting. You can feed your family with the activity, but you also have something fun to post on Instagram where it's really hard to come up with new ideas. And our list shows very different looking data for baking than we saw with paper products. So let's start with yeast. To be fair, yeast is not an item that you see on most people's weekly shopping list, but that changed fast when the pandemic hit. So this isn't a gradual jump. This is just a huge spike. All of a sudden, when the pandemic news was announced, you just saw a ton of people adding yeast to their shopping list. In fact, it was about a 500% jump in a week of people adding it to their list. That has continued to stay elevated, although not quite to the levels that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic. It has trickled off throughout the summer into the fall, but again, this has been consistent and never dropped below 2019 levels. And then in one other thing about real world sales, in May, the CEO of Kroger, Rodney McFarland, came out and said that Kroger had seen a 600% jump in sales of yeast. But our list data told us that this was going to happen basically in the first week of March. So we started to see this, and then as people actually purchased the yeast, you could see that in the in-store sales numbers. And let's look at flour. So we can't do a ton with yeast without flour. So we're seeing a similar trajectory, basically a steep increase right as the pandemic hit, and then a slow trickle, but we're still seeing elevated levels over what we saw in 2019. So unlike paper products, we see holiday spikes for these types of products anyway, so we wanted to include that in our data before we went into predictions. Yeah, paper products are usually pretty flat throughout the year, but you can see in 2019, and honestly, I could show you the 2017 and 2018 numbers, and it looks pretty similar. Around Thanksgiving and Christmas time or Hanukkah time, you see people starting to bake a lot more. So we're expecting to see those spikes on lists anyway. So our best prediction, what's to come? This is going to be a huge year for baking. Absolutely, the whole team agrees. What we're seeing is really highly elevated levels across the year. It's been consistent. We're not seeing that drop. Fall and winter holidays are going to be big. People are going to want to find comfort and honor traditions, maybe even more so than they have in past years. And all of a sudden, we have a lot more bakers than we ever did because people are picking up the new holiday. So if you are marketing one of these products, you're going to want to be on these lists. Or if you want to get to these bakers, you're going to want to target the people that are adding these types of items. All right, let's go into the next one. So beer and spirits. We all know that the pandemic is a bummer, to put it lightly. No more bars, no more parties, lots of boredom. So I bet some of you guys can guess what that means for beer and spirits and then how people are buying those in store. But let's start with beer. So when we looked at the data at the beginning of the year, beer on 2020 lists looked remarkably like 2019 lists, almost to a T, and it probably helps that the Super Bowl was on the same weekend in both years. But then the pandemic hit. Now, think back to what we saw with the paper products and baking. Both of those saw huge spikes. That's not the case with what we saw with beer. It's actually kind of a slow, gradual, but steady rise and increase over 2019 numbers. And that elevation has stayed throughout the year. But there is something that's unique about this category and something that we find a little comforting, that life as we know it has not changed completely. And that's that people are still celebrating. So a couple of weeks before Memorial Day, we saw some similar trends to what we had seen in 2019. And that were people were still planning on celebrating it in some way. So you started to see beer spike right there. And then we saw the same thing in 4th of July time. So people were planning on a party as well. In fact, for these holidays, the amount of beer on 2020 list was closer to what we saw in 2019 than it had been in the previous months before, just around the holiday times. So people did not change their traditions. The times when they were going to celebrate at home still look similar to what they did in 2019 and 2018. Tequila is a similar story, sorry. So same levels, kind of consistent to what we had seen in previous years, all the way up until the pandemic. So that's early March right there. And what you can see is that after a couple of months of quarantining, people were really ready to celebrate Cinco de Mayo, and they celebrated big. But this time they celebrated it at home. So again, this line reflects what people were planning to buy in a grocery store or a liquor store right before Cinco de Mayo. So everybody was planning on buying tequila and bringing it home. We saw a similar jump for 4th of July planning, maybe not quite as dramatic as we saw for Cinco de Mayo, but you could still see that people were celebrating. So what's happening here? A couple of big trends. One, consumers are drinking more at home, bars are closed, or maybe they're thought of as dangerous. And a beer after work now means grabbing one from the fridge after you shut down your laptop. 2, people are still celebrating. So the celebrations might look different. Maybe they're 10 people or fewer, but they're happening. And it's pretty clear that for Americans, holiday traditions are sacred. So our prediction, pretty much like baking, beer and spirits brands are going to have an amazing year when it comes to the holidays and what people are buying specifically in the store, not necessarily at restaurants or bars. Grocery store sales around these products are going to see unprecedented levels. Again, we're looking at the combination of how people celebrate and how people buy these products on a normal year, plus the consistent levels that we're seeing throughout this year so far. And there's no reason to think that these are not going to be put into the basket again for these holiday parties. Our advice to you that if you have a brand, there's beer spirits brands, get ready to target these shoppers. But again, if you're just a product that wants to be in the basket with these these holiday goers carts, then you're going to want to target these same shoppers. All right, so one more, and then we'll wrap up. One more product category. Kind of similar to what we see with baking, maybe a little bit with spirits. There is some shopping going on with people just trying to use food for comfort. So with indulgence items, we have seen some growth. It's been a little bit surprising, and I'll show you why. Early March is not usually the time when we expect to see a huge spike in ice cream on grocery lists. This year, that changed. So what we found really interesting in this category was that this appears to be new demand. And what I mean by that is with beer, you can kind of make sense of this idea of people are used to grabbing a beer at the bar, but now they have to replace that with something that they're going to drink at home. With baking, suddenly people have a lot more time. It's more of a hobby than just consumption. So there's a whole new reason to buy baking products that has emerged. But with ice cream, we were sort of scratching our heads a little bit. So when we see this huge spike in ice cream happening right around the pandemic, we were thinking about a couple of things. One, it's not summer yet, so the temperatures didn't get a lot warmer. And 2, there's actually fewer reasons to celebrate or to eat ice cream. There's no more birthday parties, fewer get-togethers. But still, the purchase intent around this product skyrocketed and has stayed high throughout the rest of the year. When we look at chocolate, it's a similar story. So usually we see the big spike around chocolate around Valentine's Day. And you can see that both 2019 and 2020 numbers match each other pretty closely. But look at that spike And if I showed you previous years, that might be the biggest spike that we see all year. But look at that compared to what we saw with the pandemic. Now, maybe baking has a play in this, but when we looked at the baking list and the overlap with chocolate, that doesn't tell the whole story. This looks like a comfort item. People are buying it more because it feels good to have, right? And treat yourself when things aren't going great. So similar to what we showed you with baking, we wanted to take a quick look at what this looks like throughout the year. Again, ice cream's pretty consistent. We do see a trend up during summer, which makes total sense, and maybe a small spike around the holidays. For chocolate, we see the big spike around Valentine's Day, and then it stays relatively flat throughout the year. So our graphs look nothing like this, which made it really hard to predict what's coming next. So our best predictions. This one's tough. I'm going to say that marketers of these brands should expect to see slightly increased levels of demand. We are seeing that people are indulging right now for normalcy and comfort. We are seeing activity levels for these items continue to surge a little bit with the notion of quarantine 15, right, which I guess is here. And so you can expect heightened levels, but based on what we've seen, we're not predicting the same big spikes that we've seen with other categories. So probably heightened, but not the big spikes and valleys that we've seen with the categories that we showed you previously. Okay, with that, in summary, so we kind of promised you that we would give you something actionable for holiday planning, but here's the deal. It's really hard when it comes to almost every category, every product within those categories looking very different this year than they have in previous years. And there's some big variables coming up. So second wave of COVID could have some changes, vaccine timing, the election, and like one of my teammates said earlier, God knows what else 2020 has in store for us. So our advice to everybody on this call is be ready for multiple scenarios. So what we're advising our clients, and actually what best practices some clients have brought to us, is that they're identifying the data sources that are going to help them understand the changing market. And more importantly, they're trying to figure out the data sources that are going to specifically help them understand how the market will affect their products and how they're bought in store. We think that the grocery list data that we showed you should be one of those sources, of course, but you should probably have a combination. We're also advising our clients to have contingency plans for how they'll use or react to this data. So think through some of the outcomes that we showed you that played out this year. Increased demand for your category, decreased demand for your category, different trends in different regions or states. All of these things could have an effect on how effective your marketing is in the next couple months. We have clients right now, usually some of our bigger clients, but some of our savvy smaller clients are positioning themselves to be able to react and optimize their programs, not with just AdAdapted, but across their partners, depending on how things play out and depending on what this type of data tells them. These teams are definitely counting on big Q4s and Q1s, so they want to be ready. They don't want to leave that to chance. And then in final summary, so there's going to be a lot of money spent at the grocery store this year. That should make all CPG marketers excited. Some brands are surely going to make out like bandits, and we're trying to help them do so. But it's going to be a lot of fun to watch what happens. So if you think that some of this customized data would help you, please just let us know. Obviously, we're only able to cover a couple of categories, but as a thank you for joining us, we would be happy to pull some customized data and make some recommendations to you if you think it would help. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to everybody. Real quick, I guess, before we go to questions, we'll also follow up with a white paper as well as a link to this recording. But yeah, let me know about questions and we'll jump in. Okay, question. Okay, so how is this information used for targeting? So AdAdapted, like I said, we have a network of grocery list apps that we work with. And with these apps, we can see what people are adding things like milk, what people are adding things like, Pepsi. We can see that coming in and we can do a couple of things. We can target them with products that we think they'll like based on what we've seen on their list before. And we can optimize around what people are adding to their list. We also have a really cool ad product that lets us trigger ads based on what somebody in real time is adding to their list. So We do a couple of things. We look at the overall trends, but we also look on a individual consumer level to make sure that our targeting is most effective. Can you pull data on subcategories within the beer space, such as craft beer or styles like IPA? Yes. So when we're looking, I mean, of course, like any data set, as you get more and more narrow, volume does go down a little bit, but absolutely. So sometimes we're even targeting off of actual like competitors or real names. So maybe somebody doesn't want to just target beer, they want to target a type of beer, or maybe they want to target based on a specific brand of beer, whether it's a competitor or some other brand that makes them think that that would be the perfect list for their brand to be on. So yes, we can target in all those different ways. Okay, I totally see the value of targeting grocery that I represent a dairy brand where there is a lot of brand competition. How do I address at-shelf decision-making and those challenges? So one thing that we're really good at that we like doing is when we can serve an ad to somebody, it's not just serving an ad based on what they have on their shopping list data. What we do is we serve somebody an ad when they like what they see, they click on it, it adds the product directly to their shopping list. So that's helping in a couple of different ways. One, we're able to target people when they have their list app open and their app shelf. So maybe they're looking at their phone in store, but even if they're not, even if they added it to their list 3 days before they went to the grocery store, that product is still there. So our clients know that their product is making it up to shelf. Somebody's actually standing there looking at their phone when they're in front of the aisle. And so that brand name is there, so that person grabs that product and puts it into their basket. All right, guys. Any other questions before we end? A good one. So what do we see with the, I think this person's saying, what do we see with the changes coming with iOS 14? So Apple announced that they were going to make changes to how they allow people to target IDFA, so their mobile ad IDs, basically making it harder to retarget people from app to app. So really good news for us is when we're integrated with these apps, we have a direct connection and we can see what people are adding to their list, and that doesn't have to be based on IDFA. So we can see that data won't be interrupted in any way. I'll be able to pull the same charts that I just showed you today, a year from now. Knock on wood, barring any other changes. What will be affected is our ability to retarget from app to app, but actually we're working on an exclusive partnership right now that we think will help us get around that. So we're feeling pretty confident that we can deliver for our clients more so than the other programmatic solutions out there that are going to be really hit by this. All right, guys, it looks like, oh, one last question. Do we work with retailer apps? So the answer is yes. Most of the apps that we work with are retailer agnostic or third-party apps that people use to shop, usually at multiple places. We do see people sometimes writing on their list things like Kroger list or Walmart list, but sometimes they're making lists that they can shop at the farmer's market as well as the grocery store and CVS and make multiple stops. Our technology works also with with retailers and e-com as well. In fact, we just got a patent around some of our technology that gives us even more of a competitive advantage, allows people to add something to an e-com cart with one click. So we're starting to talk to some retailers about integrating that to make sure that their retailer media is even more effective. All right, guys, with that, we are at 12:30, so I'm going to end right on time. But thank you, everybody, for joining. This was awesome. And if you have any questions, my team will follow up, and we'll see if we can answer them for you. But thank you very much, and have a great day.